but in the spirit of time, I'm going to get us started. Good afternoon, I'm Cecily Spelling and I'm the Membership Programme Manager at UK 100. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this lunchtime learning on making the most of the Warm Homes Plan. UK 100's Lunchtime Learning Series is an opportunity for us to bring together a range of perspectives, insights and examples from UK 100 members and the wider sector on the current and future state of best practice on local climate action. And today's topic is the recently launched and much anticipated Warm Home Plan and how local government can make the most of this landmark investment in their efforts to deliver warmer, more efficient homes. Some brief housekeeping to kick us off. Only panelists will be visible. We have a Q&A function for you to ask questions in, so please do make use of that when speakers are talking. If you have burning questions, get them in that Q&A section as soon as possible. You can upvote your questions as well to make sure that they get asked. The more upvotes they have, the more likely they are to be asked in the Q&A section. We know we're virtual, but we really do like to know who's joining us today and encourage you to chat and share your own experiences in the chat. So please do feel free to introduce yourself, where you're from, what council or combined authority you're joining from today. The presentations are being recorded and will be shared afterwards along with the slides, but the Q&A will not be recorded. And if you need them, closed captions are available for this session if needed. You just need to access them at the bottom of the page in the navigation bar. I think that's everything. If there are any tech issues at any point, then do feel free to point them in the chat and the team will do their best to resolve them. So, before we begin, I just wanted to highlight the latest training opportunity, which is UK 100 Connect. At the end of January, we launched applications for this exciting new training programme. It's our new climate communications and engagement training. This is our first opportunity for both elected officials and officers to come together on the same learning journey, working together to boost their climate comms, tackle misinformation, safeguard existing and future delivery and build public trust in your local climate ambitions. Excuse me. Delivered across the year from March to November, the programme offers 5 online training sessions for participants, quarterly peer learning sessions and ongoing support. So there's a real wraparound support network as part of this training process, and applications for the 2026 cohort are open, but they close this Sunday, the 1st of March. So if you're thinking of applying, what are you waiting for? Colleagues going to put the link for the application in the chat, and if you're full members and you've not yet completed our annual survey to offer advice and insights on future priorities and future training programmes like this UK 100 Connect programme, please check your emails as we really value your input. Okay, so we're changing slide, and now without further ado, we're on to the focus of today's lunchtime learning, which is the Warm Homes Plan. So with our homes accounting for roughly 22% of UK emissions, UK 100 has long advocated for initiatives which support scaling up of domestic retrofit with place-based delivery at their heart, because we know so well that local government is best placed for the local delivery side of things. This has included our End the Wait Insulate campaign, which was launched back in 2022, which outlined a plan to revise the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, saving £1,500 a year for tenants. It also included early calls for a new 16 billion long-term investment up to 2050 to ensure every single social housing property in the UK would be upgraded to net zero standard to permanently reduce bills and support over 80,000 jobs. So back in 2022, we were calling for that large sum of investment in the long-term retrofit programmes. They heard our calls as the Warm Homes Plan has now been published, and in this webinar, we're going to unpack what that means for you, local government, and highlight examples of best practice of delivery to date from combined and local authorities and explore how we can all work together to replicate this. So the ambition for this webinar is that you leave with a clearer understanding of how local government fits into the Warm Homes Plan, opportunities to shape the flow of investment into communities, and how you can deliver domestic retrofit at pace and scale, including with local stakeholders and different tiers of government as devolution gains momentum. The 15 billion of investment in the government's warm home plans delivers historic investment in Britain's housing stock to cut energy bills, tackle fuel poverty, and accelerate the deployment of low carbon technology across the UK. And we celebrated the plan's recognition of the importance of local leadership, with mayors placed firmly in the driving seat of delivery, and existing tools such as the local area energy plans recognised as key to coordinating home upgrades and network capacity. So we were really pleased to see the interconnections. The plan also comes very close to delivering one of UK 100's key recommendations from our Beyond Targets report, which was published last year, which is all about embedding co-benefits through cross-sector partnerships to drive progress on warm homes. The plan explicitly recognises the broader outcomes of delivering domestic retrofit on public health, regeneration, and energy planning. So whilst we celebrated the plan's delivery of our key asks and those of local leaders, there are a few gaps that remain, which our speakers will talk about in a bit more detail, but for our specific area of concern is the withdrawal of public sector decarbonisation scheme funding with no replacement, leaving local government without equivalent resource to upgrade public buildings such as schools and hospitals. So we are launching a campaign calling for equivalent funding for public building decarbonisation, ensuring that you have the resource to cut bills and emissions from your estate, and ensuring that the same children whose homes will be made warmer through the Warms Home Plan are not being sent to drafty, cold schools at the same time. So yes, that's our kind of work from UK 100 on the Warm Homes Plan to date. We have a lot of views. There's a lot of information on our website to those different reports, which my colleague Kelsey's put in the chat box. So do take a look at that. But you haven't come to hear from me. You've come to hear from our expert speakers. So I'd like to introduce our first, who is Emma McElvey, Policy and Communications Officer at Energy Saving Trust, who's going to walk us through local government's role in the Warm Homes Plan. Over to you, Emma.
Thanks so much for the introduction. So for those of you who don't know Energy Saving Trust, we are an independent organisation dedicated to promoting energy efficiency, low carbon transport and sustainable energy use. And we deliver programmes on behalf of both national and local government to support households, communities and businesses take climate action. And today I'm going to run through my big focus on two key areas in the Warm Homes Plan that are of interest to us. So that's the new Warm Homes Agency and also the changing landscape for financial support. So I'll reflect on a review of them, what it might mean for local government going forward, and try and weave in some examples of action that's already been taken. Next slide, please. But just to kick off, I'll briefly reflect on our overarching perspective on the Warm Homes Plan. So we are cautiously optimistic, recognising that it's a positive foundation for us to build on in the coming years. The plan did have a clear, consistent message that home upgrades can bring down bills and that there would be an offer for everyone on the table. And there was significant progress made in relation to some of our key policy asks, including improving access to advice and progressing critical policy enablers like the confirmation of the new minimum energy efficiency standards for the private rented sector. However, further detail and clarity is needed around how the Warm Homes Plan and the infrastructure surrounding it will deliver at both a national and local level to support households in practice. And we recognise that the publication of the plan may have created more questions than answers for local government and are keen for details to be provided quickly to avoid extended uncertainty. So moving on, I'll now discuss what was announced in relation to the Warm Homes Agency. So the Warm Homes Agency is set to be a dedicated public body to support people upgrade their homes and coordinate delivery. It's set to provide impartial advice from 2027 through an enhanced digital first advice and information platform with the aim of creating a national spine for advice provision. The plan states that it will work at both a national and local level. It will play a role in consumer awareness raising, and it will support all tenure types to take advantage of home upgrades. And there's also potential for it to play an increasing role in consumer protection going forward. So just moving on to what our view at Energy Saving Trust is of the Warm Homes Agency. So we have long called for a national retrofit advice service in England to provide consistent advice provision and remove the postcode lottery. So we were really pleased to see advice highlighted as a priority for the new agency. Yet the details of how advice will be provided through the Warm Homes Agency are still unclear. There are several points that we think will be critical to ensure there are no gaps in advice provision, whether delivered at a local or national level. This includes providing personalised, tailored advice that accounts for specific household and property circumstances, so people are confident that they're installing measures that are right for them. Also, we think it's critical that advice is attuned to the needs of the most vulnerable, so that includes providing access to in-person advice for those that need it most. And we know the importance of local advice services, which understand the needs and circumstances of their areas and how advice and engagement should be shaped around these. So we think that there should be really strong referral pathways between the new agency and any existing or future local services to ensure a streamlined consumer journey. And it's also important that the creation of the new agency doesn't delay action on advice provision at a local level. So it should quickly be made clear how the new agency will actually go about working with local services. But to move on to provide an example of some good practice in terms of advice provision. So we deliver the North East Warm Home Service on behalf of the North East Combined Authority. And as of July 2025, the service has advised over 2,000 households. There are two important lessons from this programme. Firstly, the service provides multi-channel advice, including advice online and via telephone. In-person advice is also offered for vulnerable and hard-to-reach households, and this multi-channel approach helps overcome attitudinal barriers and build trust to encourage action. It also enables the service to meet people where they are and ensure advice needs are met regardless of circumstances. Secondly, partnerships and effective referral pathways have been really critical for success. The service itself provides key support on how to improve homes, but working with trusted partners means households get the holistic support that they need, whether that be accessing crisis support or money advice. And North East Warm Homes works in partnerships with Citizens Advice, local authorities, or delivery partners, Community Action Northumberland and Groundwork, amongst others, to deliver this holistic support. And by working in this partnership way, we can ensure that the services also reach those who may not typically engage. And the new agency will need to work closely with services just like this, delivering on the ground to ensure a clear consumer journey. So moving on to the second kind of theme of my presentation, I'll discuss what was announced in relation to financial support. So the Warm Homes Plan confirms several changes that will be happening in relation to financial support going forward. So there will be 4.4 billion of grant funding made available for low-income households to install tailored packages, including low-carbon technologies and insulation measures. This is initially set to be delivered through the existing schemes, the Warm Homes Social Housing Fund and Warm Homes Local Grant, before being consolidated into a single scheme. The intention for the single scheme will be to move towards area-based delivery. And from the plan, area-based delivery will require local government to work in partnership with a variety of actors, including the new agency, district network operators to ensure alignment with ongoing energy planning work, and also Great British Energy, who are supporting local and community-owned renewable energy generation through the local power plan. Further details and devolution implications are set to be published in March and will provide a clearer picture of local government's role in delivering this new scheme. A new Warm Homes Fund was also set up, which will be comprised of 2 billion in low and zero interest consumer loans to be delivered in partnership with the financial sector, and 2.7 billion in innovative finance for home upgrades, with a consultation to follow later this year to help design this. One of the possible options noted for the new Warm Homes Fund was the potential for loans for local authorities or housing associations to unlock large-scale home upgrade options. So moving on to our review of the changing financial support landscape. So on the positive side, we think a consolidated scheme will make the consumer journey for low-income households easier and build longer-term trust and confidence. The consumer loan offer should also make home upgrades more accessible, although the devil will be in the detail of how attractive these loans are, and driving uptake remains a challenge. We had previously encouraged the UK government to provide tiered grants across the income scale to ensure there was not a cliff edge of support for those who are not eligible for fuel poverty schemes, but may be reluctant or unable to take out a loan. And the plan unfortunately didn't take this forward, although the Warm Homes Fund could be potentially a way to support this group. The shift to area-based delivery will also need to recognise that local government across the country will be coming at this from varying starting points, with some having more resources to quickly deliver. The plan does state that the new agency will play a role in building capacity and upskilling local government, but more certainty on what this actually looks like is needed. We have already worked with and supported local government go further to take action to improve the local finance offer in their areas. For example, we have worked with Waltham Forest Council to pilot and now deliver an energy upgrade loan scheme, which provides interest-free funding for residents and landlords in the least efficient properties to upgrade their homes. Financial support is provided alongside tailored advice to empower residents to install measures right for their circumstances. And this type of local action should continue to be encouraged and shows how it will be critical to have strong referral pathways so households are directed to where they can receive the most relevant financial support. From our experience delivering the Home Energy Scotland grant and loan scheme, we do also know the impact of combining financial support with access to impartial tailored advice to ensure people are made aware of all eligible support and are not missold products. So just to quickly wrap up from my side, the Warm Homes Plan does provide a solid foundation on which we can deliver home upgrades at scale, but there is a degree of uncertainty over the practical mechanisms of delivery and the role of local government within that. The new Warm Homes Agency will be a critical vehicle for advice provision, but it does not negate the need for strong, locally rooted services. And a shifting landscape for financial support should make home upgrades more accessible. And there are already examples of local government going further and faster than the national picture, and this should continue to be encouraged. But yeah, happy to take any questions at the Q&A, and also my email address is there, so feel free to email me if you want to talk more about our research or policy work. Thank you.
Marvellous. Thank you so much, Emma. Really useful insights and a great kind of summary of what is quite a monumental plan. So thank you. I'm very pleased to introduce George Sims as our next speaker, who is Head of Net Zero Homes and Communities at the West Midlands Combined Authority and has the almighty task of leading the Combined Authority's mission to retrofit over 1 million homes in the region by 2041. So George, over to you.
Thanks very much, Cecily. I think it's probably worth starting by saying that we, to get to the point where we are, to have our devolution deal, to have funding from the local net zero accelerator, which I'll come on to in a minute, I think it puts us in a really good position to be able to take advantage of some of the opportunities in the Warm Homes Plan, and there are a lot of these. It has taken an awful lot of work to get to this point, but also we're very lucky, and I'll explain a little bit about why we've been lucky as well. I think when I joined the Combined Authority, we were in a position where we probably, we just won retrofit funding for the first time, grant for social housing, decarbonisation fund, sustainable warmth competition as well, and we were at the point of building capacity through those programs, starting to develop a track record of delivery. But we knew then, as all of you will do, that the way that retrofit funding has worked in the past has been really fragmented. It's been quite short term. It hasn't really been conducive to doing things on the scale that we need and building the market in the way that we needed to. So we were very keen to change that. We're also very keen to try and take an approach which encourage more place-based delivery, and it's probably worth thinking about, well, why is that? Because sort of place-based retrofit, like fabric first retrofit, is one of those terms that sometimes it feels like it's chucked about as sort of almost received wisdom, but there are some really good reasons for taking a place-based approach, and we're reflecting on why we wanted to do that and why government funding didn't work in a way that, and probably still doesn't work in a way that we need to truly facilitate place-based delivery. Aside from the fact that yes, you may get some efficiencies in delivery, in cost and so on, that it might be easy to engage people within a single place, we have to think about how we are likely to be able to achieve a sort of clean energy transition within this country, and it will require moving from petrol to electricity for vehicles, from gas to mainly electricity, but also district heating for homes, as well as greening the grid. And what that means is that there's quite a lot of infrastructure implications as well when we talk about decarbonising homes. It's not just a question of going, right, heat pump, PV insulation in a home, there you go, finished. To get the most out of it, both in terms of achieving it at the sort of lowest cost, but also achieving the greatest co-benefits to homes and public purse, and creating sort of economic opportunities, we think that's much better done in a coordinated way. And in fact, you just couldn't really engage with the infrastructure providers that you need. So the likes of electricity distribution companies, gas networks, heat network providers, and is that taking an approach that is truly place-based, in that it takes on board the needs of communities, local people, to design solutions that are attractive and work for them, is really hard work. And we've never had the space to do that really within our grant funded programs, because you have a year, 2 years, get people signed up, get the installation done, finished, very limited evaluation, very limited ability to coordinate things, because you're always having to be quite responsive to short-term application deadlines. So you can try and do that to an extent. We have tried to do that, but also as a combined authority, we thought it was really important to try and put some of our own money into it to prove the model. So years ago, we put in money to a net zero neighbourhood in Dudley, quite small scale, only 1.65 million, but that would allow us to take a sort of longer term approach around engagement, around bringing in things like transport improvements, green space improvements as well. Given that those were the things that actually people really cared about, possibly more so than the retrofit. And so while you can engage people around retrofit, actually we felt we just needed to engage people about their area, how they felt about the place they lived, what the change was that they wanted to see. And that demonstrator is coming to an end, and it's been sort of reasonably successful. It's had quite a lot of learning about it, which I won't have time to go through today. As well as awarding funding to one local authority in Dudley, we gave the other 6 constituent members within the combined authority the chance to develop net zero neighbourhood plans, so that if ever there was the opportunity to attract more funding, we could look at building on those areas. And we've been lucky enough to do so, partly through the local net zero accelerator, the main aim of which is to look at how you might fund place-based delivery and what the finance structures mechanisms would be to do that. But it's also allowed us to progress those projects. And I think this is where the kind of luck comes in, because on the one hand, we've been delivering our standard grant programs. On the other, we've been trying to build a cohort of net zero neighbourhoods. And the aim was always to try and put more funding into those net zero neighbourhoods, to develop them, to be able to prove a model of place-based delivery with a kind of more forgiving timescale, at least in terms of the initial engagement, and then try and prove that model at scale, work out ways in which we could improve the business case, work out ways in which we could improve delivery. And when I say the sort of business case, to get all those 1.2 million homes in the region to net zero, there's absolutely no way we can do that with just grant funding alone. So we'll need to attract other sources of funding, whether that's through National Wealth Fund, whether it's public equity, whether it's private equity, private debt. There will need to be a huge amount of repayable finance in there, and we're a long way off from proving that still. But it needs to pay for itself. We think that it can do. So we want to be able to sort of show that it can by gathering evidence through our net zero neighbourhood demonstrators and other projects to improve the investment case. So those are the building blocks that we kind of put in place. And we had lobbied government fairly consistently through our devolution discussions that actually we needed to approach funding for retrofit and energy in a different way. We had evidence, plenty of evidence, that the sort of national schemes weren't really working in the way that they needed to. We were starting to get some evidence around why a different approach would work. But we weren't really entirely confident that would come to anything. The government would sort of really give us the chance to do that. And up until sort of right at the last moment in our integrated settlement funding discussions, this was something where we were expecting maybe to get a small amount of money devolved to us potentially. We made the case around various things that we thought would help to enable the work that we were doing. And right at the very last moment in the discussions, there was a bit of a breakthrough, and government decided actually, that it was willing to give up some of its national funding programs and enable us to, take a sort of more flexible approach to how we use that funding, and that's become part of the Trailblazer Devolution deal. So what that will enable us to do is to put more money into the net zero neighbourhoods, but also to use that funding in a slightly more flexible way. And I say slightly more flexible because actually I think at the same time, government has slightly changed the national programmes. They are a bit more flexible than I think they were in the past. But also there were limits on what we could do because there are statutory targets attached to those government programmes that we have to meet as well. So our aim was to create as much breathing space as we can to be able to further our net zero neighbourhood ambitions. And we're right at the beginning of doing that. So whether that's a success or not, I don't know. But I think it's also worth saying that the Warm Homes Plan gives us a tremendous opportunity to access finance, so not grant funding, that £2.7 billion that Emma mentioned before, that's there for sort of innovative finance. That's a real opportunity for place-based delivery for scaling the model further. So that sort of explains a bit about how we got there. The actual process of putting in place the devolution deal and negotiating that, I'd say the work that we've done with DESNZ has hopefully paved the way for others, and it should be a lot easier process, I think, for the sort of next time round. But those discussions actually weren't too hard until right at the end when we were talking about the specific outcomes and the specific numbers. And I think now that they've done that once, it will be a lot easier. I think what was a lot more challenging for us in designing our program was the working with the local authorities and getting things on board, not because they weren't pulling in the same direction, not because they didn't want the same outcomes. I think it's there's a couple of things. First of all, anytime you get a group of lots of different organisations, getting the kind of agreement and endorsement is can be a challenge. I think people were worried about the uncertainty to a certain extent as well. But also, I think one thing that I'd say to any combined authority or local authority in this position is that the communication perhaps didn't work in the way that we expected it to or hoped to. So we sort of set up a group. We talked through collectively what we thought a good approach would be to the problem, how we were going to approach the negotiations, how we wanted the scheme to work, and the scheme kind of works on a fair share basis rather than a competitive basis by and large. But we were kind of expecting that people would go away from that meeting, speak to the rest of their organisation, and that it would kind of filter through the rest of the organisation. So I think one of the learnings would be we needed to do more engagement at a number of different levels and get agreement not just from the retrofit officers but also from finance officers, chief execs, members, and do a lot more of that more comprehensively. So that'll be kind of one of the key lessons that we've learned. I'll leave it there because I think I'm nearly out of time, but also I suspect there will be quite a few questions on this, and I'd rather give more time over to questions. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of a snapshot of our experience and how we're looking to draw together several aspects, several opportunities into a more coherent place-based approach.
Great. Thank you so much, George. I'm sure you'll be inundated with questions on the learnings there. So yeah, thank you very much for your insights. I'm now pleased to introduce our last speaker, who is Helen Burridge, Hertfordshire Climate Change and Sustainability Partnership Manager, who will be talking about their work in Hertfordshire. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you, Cecily. Can I just confirm I've still got 10 minutes, or would you like me to reduce it slightly?
10 minutes.
Lovely, thank you. So hello everyone, I'm Helen Burridge. I'm the manager of HCCSP. So HCCSP is 10 district and borough councils in Hertfordshire, and then the county council and Hertfordshire Future, which is the economic partnership that sits within the county council. We are a partnership body, so although I sit within East Herts Council for Board and Lodgings, it's very much a convening role across the county. We have not yet gone through LGR, that is timetabled for April 2028, so we're still a two-tier authority for the next 2 years. Here in Hertfordshire, we're lucky enough to be the first locality in the MCS-funded Local Area Retrofit Accelerator project. I'm going to try to keep acronyms to a minimum, but I apologise, it will just keep on going. So MCS Foundation is the micro certification scheme. That's what MCS stands for. They're the people who authenticate solar panel installations, and they have a foundation of, say, I've no idea what the numbers are, but say a solar panel is installed on your house for 20 quid, goes to MCS to say, yes, you've done it well. And a fiver of that 20 quid goes into a pot to help progress more substantial interventions into low carbon and retrofit. And so they had this pot of money and they wanted to accelerate how local areas approach retrofit. So beginning in 2024, we were awarded time and expertise to develop a retrofit strategy and work out how we can ready our retrofit system to accelerate the action. So I've been invited to consider what our experience is in relation to the Warm Homes Plan, but I don't want to just say go and get some funding, because obviously that's not very helpful. So I thought I would start by going through what we did to get our system prepared in Hertfordshire, what we learnt through Lara, and then going back, thinking about the Warm Homes Plan. So if you could just go back one slide for me, please. I'm not quite as far ahead as you think I am, sorry. There it is, thank you. So the Warm Homes Plan could be transformative. I was reassured, though, with Emma's presentation just now. Local areas need to be system ready, but the detail's not quite there yet. So the good thing is that we have some time, because the Warm Homes Plan is detailed but not very detailed, to get retrofit systems ready so that when the money and the detail becomes apparent, you're then able to move at pace. So we've worked over the last 2 years to get retrofit ready in our area, in part by the local authority owning the role that it has as a convener, and also then endorsing other stakeholders to crack on. What we realised is that there's a lot of people in the retrofit system who are waiting for somebody else to tell them to crack on. And actually, if you can have that reassurance piece, that although there is national policy uncertainty, there are funding cycles that are stopping and starting, residents are interested, they are engaged, they are trying to work their way through, and actually people can work together and alongside one another to progress this when the detail arrives on the Warm Homes Plan. So what Lara gave us. We had we didn't have funding, we had in-kind support to deliver 3 full-day workshops. So we convened a process, but we didn't lead it. We invited over 30 representatives of the retrofit system and co-created a retrofit strategy. So what that meant was we had anyone and everyone, including community groups, colleges, training institutions, builders, big scale builders, and smaller retrofit installers. We worked very hard to get the landlord social housing populations represented. That wasn't exactly straightforward, but then we also had planning and building regs and others and architects involved in the room as well. So although the in-kind funding was helpful, and obviously it helped having consultants there leading the charge, what actually was the most helpful was getting structured collaboration from senior decision makers. And so there was a little bit of a challenge trying to work out who had to be in the room, because obviously 3 full days is a big ask of a resource for these organizations. But having somebody that was senior enough to be able to understand the system's nature, but operational enough to know what stuff needed to get done, meant that those conversations were really good. We also had that mandate, once everyone had that buy-in, to align the 2 tiers of authorities and the hyper-local street level and the region level, to then think about what the shared goals might be across that system. We had a bit of a conversation on who leads what and who's holding responsibility for different areas. We talked about shared ownership and shared responsibility, but ultimately a lot of it was just saying in a room, we're all trying and it's really blooming hard and that's okay. So at the end of all of that, there was a SWOT analysis, there was a vision, there was a mission statement, all that jazz. We ended up with a local retrofit strategy, which you can see at our website. The link is there, and that is a picture of the document. So what worked really well, what we started with, part of the process of applying for the funding, was that we had to have letters of support from each of the stakeholders that we said we were in touch with. So what that meant was that the colleges, businesses, landlords, housing associations, energy companies, all sorts, they had to create a one-sider that says, we think this is a good thing. And so even if you don't have the Lara project around it, actually sort of kicking off the race and starting everything saying, this is what we are going to do, and we agree that we want to try and get on board, that really helped then getting the authorized people in the room and making sure, as I said, they had that balance between strategic and technical knowledge. Now, one thing that I must admit, I was not in. There was a lot of conversations about trusting the process, and I got a little bit tense a few times. There were some elements of, vision statements and mission statements and all that jazz, which I got a little bit clenchy about. But there was an element where actually agreeing the goals was actually very useful, because what happened was everyone walked in the room thinking, we're going to get a retrofit one-stop shop. Can we just crack on, please? And that wasn't just me saying that. But the reality was, if we talk about the strategic goals, what does a world look like that looks better? What are the actual priorities for our area? Are we thinking about insulation, or are we thinking about fuel poverty, or are we thinking about carbon savings? Those kinds of things meant that then people could work out how to pin their colors to different masts. And that was great. And the final point was that order of operations. If you start somewhere, normally local authorities start a strategy and then say, what do you think? With this one, we got everyone to say what they thought, and then the strategy evolved out of that. In fact, then, of course, it followed a relatively clear format, but it meant that people were bought in to start with. The challenge now has been that we've got this uncertain policy picture. We're not clear about funding. We're not really clear about the mandate that councils should be convening this. And there's some hesitation about, actually, is there a role for councils to meddle in retrofit more generally, or actually should the market just be doing that? And I think the Warm Homes Plan has added a little bit of colour to that. We're not quite sure in which direction yet. And then we're trying to work out that element of balancing that consistency and alignment across the national picture with what the local picture needs to be. We don't want to fall foul of public trust, and so we're really nervous about what that could look like if we have any other retrofit scandals and such like. So in terms of the Warm Homes Plan, it's great that it's ambitious and there's a breadth of scope. If we go to the next slide, thank you very much. But funnily enough, I put on my thing the line of, the devil's in the detail has already actually come up from Emma, because actually what's happened is we have an action plan with over 50 actions, and we've had to pause because we don't want to start investing money in doing something that's actually going to come down the road 3 months later. So actually what's happened is, because we don't have a retrofit one-stop shop, because we don't have a single point of convening, we don't have a brand, we don't have a website yet, we've now paused. And so actually there's a real challenge now in trying to get that mobilization happening. There's another question around the MCS Foundation have put money aside for us to deliver this action plan. Again, I know we're very lucky and we're very grateful. There's a question now, there are policies around MEES, minimum energy efficiency standards. Do we do more work with landlords to help them leverage that better? Or do we say, actually, landlords are dealt with because of MEES, leave them to it and do something that's a really tricky nut to crack, like able to pay, where there's very little framework and support? And those are two very different approaches, and actually clarifying what we want to do and where the gaps are until we've got more information from DESNZ is going to be really tricky. So my penultimate slide is that we're scaling cautiously. We've set up a governance model. So we've got a steering group that sits outside of the local authority that has interested representatives from across the stakeholder group. So each of different actions are going to be taken by colleges, by businesses, by local authorities, any number of different actions, but there needs to be some kind of system stewardship that's keeping an eye on all of the different plates that are spinning. And that's what this steering group is trying to set up. So we've got that governance in place, we've got an action plan, we've got a strategy. And so we're trying to now focus, rather than thinking, woo, and then going straight off the starting blocks, we're having to focus on slightly lower risk actions. Maybe some digital self-service tools, maybe reinstating a solar panel group buying scheme, that kind of thing, while we wait for some clearer signals, because it's really not sure at the moment actually moving too fast and then causing an issue later. We don't lack the ambition, we don't lack the motivation, but we don't want to duplicate, and then we don't want to invest money and then be made to look ridiculous if we haven't got the right get out of jail card when the national picture overtakes us. So it would be nice to say that we now have had a funded pilot and a published strategy and we're storming ahead, but we're not quite yet. We are cautiously marching rather than storming, if you like. So if we are hoping to accelerate delivery, no, you were right, go back, you're on, there we go, lovely, thank you. The operational detail is actually having the opposite effect of pausing us. So what do we do while we're waiting? I would suggest that you map, introduce and empower everyone locally who's already active, and make sure that they've met each other, that you give them that confidence, build that cross-party mandate, and make sure that it's not a political issue. I would go into more detail, but I've run out of time. So if you co-design your goals so that everyone can support them, and then start the conversations about governance locally, so that when clarity arrives, you then have those contacts and that network ready to go, and you can create that momentum to take conscious, coordinated steps together as a system, as and when the detail of the Warm Homes Plan is shared. Thanks.